Business is business. Apple has announced that despite U.S. President Donald Trump's America First policy, it is set to relocate the production of its latest $6,000 desktop computer, Mac Pro, to China. Apple cited lower shipping costs as the reason for the proposed move, which is the company's only product currently made in the U.S. However, it is not all good news for China. Apple may soon shift up to 30% of its existing production in China to Southeast Asia. So how much of Apple's maneuvering is directly related to the China-US trade tensions or a result of free market realities? And what does all this say about Apple's relationship with China today? Joining the discussion are in the Beijing studio Professor Xie Tao, Dean of the School of International Relations and Diplomacy at the Beijing Foreign Studies University, and from Philadelphia, Brandon Blackburn-Dwyer, President of Grasshopper Strategy, a consulting firm. Gentlemen, welcome to the point. So first of all, let me go to Brandon to tell us a little bit about this factory. I know it's been located in Austin, Texas. It's hiring quite a number of workforce. So if it is relocated to China, how many workers would be affected, U.S. workers?
The truth is not that many. The factory in Austin, Texas that's been in operation on the Mac Pro project since about 2013 is still a subsidiary. They're basically a contractor. They're a company that over the last year or two, as demand for the previous generation of the Mac Pro really fell off because it's a product that never really took off in any market, US or international. They've really moved to either handling refurbishing old computers or they've moved on to other projects. So this is a group that really knew they were probably not going to get the job to make the next generation Mac Pro, the new one. What's happened in Austin, Texas around this, though, is that Apple has, I think to soften this blow to some extent, opened up another couple thousand worth of jobs, but they are in the design and the research and development type of area, the more traditional types of jobs that Apple does fuel inside the United States. So Austin, Texas, I don't think is really going to hurt from this. The manufacturing plant itself really already on to other projects. The city will actually get more Apple jobs, and we're basically consolidating high-tech assembly into where it probably belonged for Apple in the first place, which is around Shanghai inside China.
But is it a bad news that this factory is being relocated outside of the United States? Brandon, again, very briefly, though.
I mean, it's always bad news. Look, right, the United States manufacturing sector doesn't ever like to hear any product, small, big, medium-sized, whatever, moving to somewhere else. But the reality here is what the U.S. is missing out on is growth of manufacturing jobs, not maintaining current manufacturing jobs, which is a pretty big differentiation.
Professor Xie here, I just talked about the calculation of Apple because of the shipping costs. They decided that it's not worth it to get a lot of components from China shipped to the United States, assembled in this factory, and then sell in the United States or in other part of the world. So, but tell us exactly how the calculation works out. Why exactly is Apple seeing the profit growing if it relocate the factory to China?
Because of the current trade war, so if you relocate the factories back to China, that means even with this potential 25% tariff from President Donald Trump, and plus the shipping cost, that would still make the Mac Pro relatively cheaper than compared with being manufactured in the United States.
Because the labor here is cheaper, or?
The labor here is relatively cheaper, and Liu Xin, you know this better than I do, that labor costs in China are also rising too.
Sure.
But even compared with the United States labor costs, I think it's make a lot of sense for Apple to do this in China.
So some people would say, look, this is exactly what trade with China does to the United States, right? Factories relocated to China, local jobs are left, and then profits go into the pockets of the big corporations, which never get fed back to the average American's bosses. So, Professor Xie, how do you counter that kind of argument? We know it is not true, but how would you persuade the average Americans?
Well, politics is different from business, right? In a businessman, they talk about money, but for politics, you talk about votes, you talk about constituents' interests. And in this particular case, because Apple is such a big, high-profile company, is an icon of American high technology. So even when Apple says, I'm going to shift, let's say, this very tiny subsidiary back to China, which involves like maybe 1,000 jobs, but it's very symbolic. It caught a lot of attention. Like Brandon says, this probably Austin, Texas will not get hurt very much at all. So in the broad context of U.S.-China trade war right now, I think Tim Cook must be facing a lot of pressure from his company and probably from some of his constituents back in California and in Texas too.
Okay, so Brandon, let me go to you again. Any potential loss besides the jobs, besides the unemployment situation of these workers, and what would be done, now that Apple is able to make more money? What would be done to help these people? Because that has been the complaint for a lot of people, that they lose their jobs because of relocation, fine, but is there retraining? Is there subsidy? Is there some other kind of help?
Well, the biggest risk for Apple right now would be President Trump. Tim Cook has been able to largely keep Apple out of the firing line, and many of the additional tariffs. He's been sort of a friendly voice within the White House, not because he's friendly with President Trump, but he's been on a big charm offensive with them. So if President Trump sees this as sort of spitting in his eye, and he turns his eye from being angry at Amazon, which he's always angry at, to being angry at Apple, that's not good for Apple at any point in time. But in the short term, the cause of harm in Texas, again, because this factory was not actually formally owned by Apple, it was actually contractor for Apple, a lot of that pressure to retrain has already fallen on the contractor. And they've done that by switching them to refurbishing computers, to fixing them, things that don't require the type of systems in broad scale. Where you're seeing Apple save money is in shipping, and that's interesting. Because in 2013, they started this factory in Texas because they thought shipping on the big computer would be safe, because they thought the big computer was heavy and hard to distribute around the United States. It would be great to have manufacturing in the U.S.
Yeah.
What they didn't count on is that manufacturing all the components, which they get from around the world, to this one random factory in Texas, actually raised their supply chain shipping costs substantially. So going to China, where they already have all those components flying into Shanghai anyway, is going to save them a substantial amount of money. Now, the hope is that they can make work better for both the Chinese workers and the U.S. workers, because that's the problem with Apple and all of its contractors.
So it's very interesting, though, that Apple is transferring the business of this factory to China, but then Apple is thinking of transferring 30% of its existing businesses to Southeast Asia. Professor Xie, what's going on here?
Apple is quite unique among many of American high-tech companies in that Apple has a big reliance on China's manufacturing expertise and China's tooling and design, and plus China's low-cost labor. This is one component that makes Apple very unique. The second aspect is that Apple not rely on China's labor and manufacturing, but also Apple relies on the China market. So that means Apple has a kind of a double reliance on the Chinese market. So one example is that last year, 2018, Apple's sales in China is $51 billion US dollars. That this came right after the United States and Europe. And so Apple needs Chinese consumers. Apple needs China's manufacturer expertise. And so even if Apple is saying it's planning to relocate 30% of its manufacturing bases in China to Southeast Asia, but that will take a long time.
Yeah, well, this is also very interesting. Some people would say, some American people would say, why don't Apple bring all of its productions to the United States, including all of the components, the production of the components to the United States? Then the problems, the shipping costs will be solved. Professor Xie, why not?
Well, if you bring everything back to the United States, like I said, one is you have labor costs, and that will make Apple very uncompetitive. Second,
very expensive.
Very expensive. And second, China is Apple's third largest market. There's no question about this. And so you need to do something and to access the China market. I think one thing you can do is to get into the Chinese market and to make something assembled, manufactured, and designed here in China.
Brandon, I have this very interesting question. So Apple is moving something from the United States to China, and then moving something from China to Southeast Asia. Why doesn't Apple just move everything to Southeast Asia, like what President Trump has said? These factories are leaving China. That's victory for the United States, even if they're not going back to the United States.
Well, President Trump is wrong, because in his mind, victory would be defined as bringing manufacturing jobs back to the United States. So by definition, if they're not coming back to the United States, which, by the way, they're not, then that's not victory. But President Trump is President Trump, and he'll declare victory whenever he pleases. The reality is, Apple is just one of many companies that is doing what we predicted would happen over 10 years ago. The rising cost of labor, the rising middle class in China, the rising diversification and education of China's working class has always meant that some manufacturing on the lower end, particularly on the assembly area, was going to move out of China. This was a worry we talked about in 2008, 2010, and 2012. The tariffs are exacerbating some of this. It's speeding it up. It's giving a lot of these companies cover to spend the money to switch their supply lines. But the reality is Apple was probably always destined to move 20 or 30% out to Bangladesh and Vietnam and other places. Amazon, Microsoft, others. Yeah. This isn't necessarily a damage to China. What it does do is it means that China has to find growth in other sectors, which it's already working towards.
So I was thinking, you know, if China follows the logic of President Trump, China should be imposing tariffs on Southeast Asian countries at this moment. But China is obviously not doing that. Professor Xie, we're talking about a serious problem, though, because manufacturings are going like water, right, from places where costs are higher to places where costs are lower. But for those people in the United States and now in China who probably are losing because of this globalized production, what has to be done?
Well, this involves a lot of government will to address the concerns of people who lose their jobs to globalization. So, for example, 2060 campaign, right? President Trump made promise again and again he's going to bring back jobs. But remember, this is like a structural forces, and many of the things that you cannot personally change. And so the best a government can do, I think any government around the world has to do, is to provide better training, education to people who lose their job, and to provide a better social welfare benefits like unemployment benefits. In the end, I think you need to get your labor force prepared for 21st century.
And the people probably also need to know that, yeah, the 21st century is already upon us. So when we are educating our children, we'll probably have to think a bit further. But it's a very complicated situation. So I do emphasize with those who are troubled by this move. I have to leave it there. Many thanks to Professor Xie Tao from Beijing Foreign Studies University and Brandon Blackburn-Dwyer, President of Grasshopper Strategies. And with that, we're coming to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got the point.